Hello, good afternoon, and welcome everybody back to another edition of Book Reviews. Um, Today is Sunday, February 16th, 2020 on the Gregorian calendar, and we're going to talk about a couple of different books today. We're going to start with Capital City by Samuel Stein. He is a city planner and a thinker, and he's been involved in housing justice movements, especially in the city of New York. And he writes from the he taught this book. So this book is about urban planning and gentrification, and what's the role of urban planning in the gentrification process, and talks a little bit about what communities can do to resist gentrification. So it was very interesting and very timely and very enlightening, especially for somebody like myself who has no background whatsoever in urban planning. Um, like I say, he starts with he's kind of the overview of planning and what the planner's role is. He goes on to does a deep dive into New York, and that's very interesting too to talk about the two most recent mayors, Bloomberg and De Blasio, and their role in gentrification in the city of New York, especially now that Bloomberg is now trying to buy the presidency. So if we read this book, you get a little bit of insight of Bloomberg's policies on housing in New York City. And then it starts talking about the current president and the role that his family played in both benefiting from public policies that allowed them to really capitalize off housing, the housing market, and then up until today, where we have basically a quote unquote developer, landlord, slumlord in the White House, and how now that's shaping policy. And the last chapter is some stories from communities that have struggled around housing and gentrification. And so for especially those of you who are in the housing movement, I think would definitely recommend it, because especially at the city level, when we start getting into housing policy, it really is really helpful to understand what planning is and how it is related to the overall process. Definitely a good recommendation. Sam Stein's Capital City. It's out on Verso Books. I got this one directly from the publisher, so you might want to consider that too. Another book I just finished reading is by Francis Yates. It's called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment. This was a pretty dense book on European history. Really, is what it's about. It talks about what she does is basically traces this current that she calls Rosicrucianism through Europe in pretty much the 17th and a little bit into the 18th centuries. And the way that she does that is through literature, just seeing the ways that this kind of school of thought crops up in different places in that time period. And basically, what the people that were first writing writing about this Rosicrucian society were doing was trying to set up a society or a group of people that could be a counterweight to the Jesuits. They're basically like Protestants during the time of the Reformation, or a little bit after, and hoping to use that to also build some political power in Europe. But of course it's tied into the Hermetic tradition in Europe, which of course goes all the way back to the mystery schools, etc. But this is a kind of a much more. This is right when the Renaissance was starting to happen, and these people were really interested in science and especially chemistry and alchemy, of course. So it's really interesting to see why Francis Yates, who did become a dame of the British Empire, was so interested in looking at this particular tradition. She really ties it back to John Dee, which is why I got this biography of John Dee, and she, I think, is trying to vindicate the historical personage of John Dee. A lot of it ties back to Britain. And John Dee was the first person to talk about a British Empire. A lot of this also had to do, like later on, with the colonization of this hemisphere. So I just kind of think it's interesting to see how, it's like why is how is the revival of an interest in Hermetic philosophy and the occult tied to the way that the historic personage of John Dee is brought back into the mainstream after being slandered for so long, and what does that have to do with really placing Britain kind of back at the top of the world's empires? Really interesting, but mostly I guess because I've been really interested in the stuff that she writes about Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism, the occult, and she cites A.E. Waite a lot because A.E. Waite used to write a lot about the Rosicrucians, and A.E. Waite was the person that made this tarot deck that is now pretty much considered the standard one. So a lot of interwoven currents in European history here. Francis Yates, The Rosicrucian Enlightenment. This one's out on Routledge. Going back, way back, I read this one right after Toni Morrison died. This is The Bluest Eye. And I don't read a lot of fiction, but once I found out that Toni Morrison had passed, I really felt the need to read some of her literature, and so I picked up The Bluest Eye. It's very beautiful narrative. It's very sad. The plot is incorporates some just very, very kind of tragic intrafamilial actions, but the way that it's told is very, very poetic. Toni Morrison, she's a beautiful writer. I'm really surprised that it took her so long to start writing her own works. She was an editor for many years, but you could see that it was worth the wait. During that time, you could tell she was just kind of developing her style of how to write a novel. So I'm looking forward to reading more Toni Morrison. Moving on, this book is called Straight with the Medicine. It's by Warren L. D'azevedo, who was a anthropologist and did a lot of studies of the Washo people. This particular book is about the Native American church, or they call it the Teepee Way, and the way that peyotism was practiced among the Washo people. Mostly I picked it out of the library to read it because we went to make a visit up to Lake Tahoe over the holidays, and one of the things that I like to do is read about have a better understanding of the land, of the people that live or are from the places that we like to visit, that we go to visit. But I also have an interest in entheogenic use of plants, religious use of plants and stuff like that. So I thought I would read it. It's interesting. It's all first person. It's an oral history, basically a compilation of oral histories. So it's people, men. They're all men telling their stories of basically how they became involved in the Native American church and how it has affected their lives, what it has meant for their community of the Washo people up around the Lake Tahoe area. So interesting book too. I haven't finished this one yet, so I'm not going to talk about it yet, but Pushed Into the Rocks is about the Kumeyaay people. I picked this one up because we made a trip down to Ensenada around time of November. But so far it's really interesting. I'll hopefully come back to this one. This book is also about the Washo people. It's called The Two Worlds of the Washo. And it's pretty much a straight up ethnography of the Washo people. It's very old. I think it's like from the 50s, 1954 or something like that. But it does give a good sense of who the Washo people were at that time, at least, and what kind of things they were going through, and the history, at least the history that the anthropologists were able to pull together for the purposes of writing the book. So if you would want a deeper understanding of the Washo people and their society, this is probably a good place to start. And probably the last one for today. This is called Where Our Food Comes From. It's by Gary Paul Nabhan. He is a writer about the earth, the land, the environment. He especially writes a lot about the Southwest. I have some other of his books up here, but this one is really interesting. It's about Vladimir Vavilov, who some of you may have heard about. Vavilov centers being places where people developed food crops. Where societies develop food crops. Vavilov was a scientist, a biologist, a botanist, and a geneticist, somewhat, in Russia, pretty much around the time of the revolution, the Russian Revolution, and his main concern was famine and how to prevent famine, but that gets into droughts and depletion and genes, and so Vavilov traveled the whole world, most of the world. And picked, he was a botanist, so he was gathering samples, and he had made a giant seed bank in Petrograd, I think it was, or maybe Leningrad, and ultimately he was labeled an enemy of the state, of the Soviet regime, and he was locked up, and he was pretty much died of starvation while he was locked up, which is really, really sad to the life of sad end to the life of such a genius. So what Gary Paul Nabhan does is kind of retraces his steps. He travels the world also, rereading Vavilov's journals. He visits the Vavilov Institute, and he kind of updates where we're at now in terms of genetic variety of food crops, and I don't know, just kind of gives us a better and deeper understanding of where we're at in terms of where our food comes from. You see the title, you think, well, is it coming from a farm or a ranch somewhere nearby, or is it really far away? Is it about that? No, it's actually about where the foods themselves come from, where the apples come from, and corn, and really interesting stuff like that. It's kind of like a work of popular science. So this one is really good, really enlightening and interesting, so I definitely recommend folks read it. Gonna do a kind of a short video today because we don't have that many books. It's been a couple months, but as usual, if there's any comments, any feedback, any suggestions, welcome to hear. Glad to hear them, and welcome your input and feedback. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great rest of your weekend, and we'll be back soon.